Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Pynakker. I'm very excited today to have a special guest on the program, Cristina Rosetti. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
I just want to give a little background. Cristina is a PhD. She got her PhD from UC Riverside. She's assistant professor of humanities at Utah Tech. She has worked on the study and the history and lived experience of Mormon fundamentalism in the Intermountain West. And we're going to get to that later on. That's really cool stuff. But one of the reasons I asked Cristina to come onto the program today was I met you last year at the Mormon History Association. And I always like to know people's backgrounds. And that's when you had told me, well, yeah, I was Foursquare. And I was like, ooh, Foursquare, this is awesome. You know, it's really interesting because I'm from the Midwest and I'm based in the southeastern United States. And there really aren't a whole lot of Foursquare out this way. So like my friend Christopher Thomas divvies it up this way. The southeastern United States, it's Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, Pentecostals. The Midwest is Assemblies of God. The West Coast is Churches of Foursquare. And the Northeast is, well, they're just all going to hell. So that's a joke. But we break it all down that way. So that kind of gives you there's almost like regional Pentecostal bodies throughout the country. Would that be a fair assessment?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So this is great. So Cristina, I want you to talk a little bit about your background, your religious background growing up before you became Foursquare, and then we'll just continue from there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think I had an interesting religious background. My mom was, she is currently pretty generically Protestant, but she had an experience being EV free, evangelical free, being independent Baptist. Her parents become independent Baptist. So she has kind of a diverse Christian experience, and now she's pretty non-denominational. And my dad was raised Catholic. He's no longer practicing. And so I come from that background. Everything's kind of just very generically Christian. We went to church on Christmas and Easter, like most people. Mm-hmm. I went to Episcopalian school most of my life, not because we were Episcopalian, but just because they were good schools, and it was available. It was right by our house, and so I didn't know what an Episcopalian was. I knew that it looked Catholic, but I had no idea what that religion was, which is funny because now my boyfriend's an Anglican priest, so I'm like, I really know what Episcopalianism is now.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, growing up, I had no idea. I got ashes on my head, and my parents were like, "Do you know what is happening?" And I was like, "No." So yeah, I mean, a pretty generic religious upbringing. I would have called myself Christian because that's what you do when you're any kid in the U.S. who has somewhat Christian parents.
Well, it so fascinates me. So it's interesting because so often a lot of people who are in the evangelical charismatic movement were kind of born into it, but then you have these churches that a lot of people are converts who convert, and often it's around high school time, maybe when they're dealing with things in life and they have questions and they're growing up and they got all these other things going on in their head and their body's changing, all this kind of stuff. And often you'll have some kind of religious experience or conversion encounter. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I went to a school in Southern Orange County for high school. I really didn't want to go to, most people who left the Episcopalian middle school ended up going to a Catholic high school. I didn't want to go. My parents weren't super excited about it either. And so I went to a public high school, and everyone was getting saved, which is Southern Orange County, everyone's getting saved in high school. I mean, you're mm-hmm. And most people who were getting saved in my high school were getting saved through Compass Bible Church, which was a pretty well-known Reformed church. So really my only point of reference for really religious kids was very conservative Reformed Calvinism. And I was just uninterested. I took for my English class, my last one, I took the Bible as literature, and so and it was taught by the youth pastor for Compass Bible Church, and so everything was very Christian even though it wasn't. And I took an art elective with my best friend, and I remember one day she came in and she had gotten saved, but she had gotten saved at a church in San Clemente, California called Living Hope Christian Fellowship. And she invited me to youth group, to Altered Youth, but spelled with an A, altered youth. Okay. And I didn't really want to go because I was I'm not I don't do youth. Like, this isn't something part of my world. But she was like, oh, it'll be great. We always get McDonald's before. And I went, and everyone was really nice, of course. It's like the very quintessential story. Like, everyone's really nice to you. And I kept going to youth group. I really loved the youth pastor's wife, Kelly Dion. She was, and still is, a really incredible woman. And I just kept going to youth group, and I got saved. And I had no idea what this religion was. I just thought, I didn't really know that there were differences in Christians. I knew that they had Hebrews 13:8 on the wall. That didn't mean anything to me at the time. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And it had a symbol on the wall, which came to be very, I came to know very well. And it took a while before I learned that it was the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel.
Okay.
And I became deeply invested in the Foursquare Church and the mission of its founder.
Okay, so now before we get into the history, which I think is really fascinating, audience, you're going to love this story. I just want to ask you, when you say you got saved, what happened?
I mean, I did ballet for most of my life. A lot of people probably are like, what? I did ballet for a lot of my life. I quit for a myriad of reasons, but one of them was tendonitis in my hips. And I had this really hard time walking. Like, I would wake up in the middle of the night with severe pain, and I would have to crawl to my parents' bedroom and get them to help me. And I just remember my mom told me to pray about it, but I was like, that's silly. And then all of a sudden, everyone at this church that is a very charismatic church starts telling me to, and I do, and I end up believing that I was healed. And I mean, the great kind of irony of that is I was. I mean, I reframe the experience a lot different now. But my hip's better, right? I haven't had this problem again.
Okay.
And I've never woken up in the middle of the night with severe pain again, and to this day. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm like, well, that's it. That's it. And so I go to church. I go to youth group the next time, and I go to my youth pastor, and I'm like, I want to be a Christian. I want to do the prayer. And he does the prayer with me. And a few weeks later, I was baptized by my youth pastor and the church pastor. I was baptized at North Beach in San Clemente in the ocean. It was coming off of red tide. It was a rough situation. It was really cold. I was baptized in the ocean. For Mormons listening, they'll find it funny that my head didn't go all the way underwater. And so I was wondering if it counted, even though Pentecostals don't have that kind of stringent view of ordinances.
Mm-hmm.
But I was like, does this count? And everyone was like, yeah, you're fine. So, so I was baptized in the ocean, and I went to camp, and I went to the Foursquare convention, and I was it. I was Foursquare.
Wow. Okay. So you're healed, and you get saved, and you get baptized. Before we go, did you get baptized in the Holy Spirit?
No, and this is actually kind of an early thing that got me out, because for those who don't know, the Foursquare Church is Pentecostal, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but the Foursquare Church historically was one of the Pentecostal churches that believed that you had to speak in tongues to be saved. You have to be baptized in the Holy Ghost, and that only means one thing. I wanted to be a missionary, and I looked at the missionary forms, and it said date of baptism, date of water baptism, and date of baptism in the Holy Ghost on the forms, and I can't answer that. And so I would sit at home all night and pray and be like, I just need to I need to speak in tongues. And I couldn't. I went to camp, and everyone is there's the night of camp where everyone's baptized in the Holy Ghost. I can't do it. I know some people are pretending to do it. I was told how to lie.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't,
Good for you.
I couldn't speak in tongues. And so, it was really hard, because then, when the idea of what your salvation is rests on a physical manifestation that you can't do, and you really believe you are saved, what is salvation? And so, without kind of knowing it, that was really kind of an early thing that bothered me about the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel.
Okay, so you got something on your shelf, if you will, early on in your experience.
like day one, right? Day one. I don't like, and everyone I know, not everyone, but most people I know speak in tongues or something like, or, you know, are acting like they do.
Yeah.
So it's the whole thing.
Food for thought. Yeah, no, I appreciate your integrity for not pretending, because that is a problem that I think that does have happened. And so yeah, thanks for keeping it real there and having integrity. I want to talk about the history of the Church of the Foursquare, and let's start with its founder, who you told me the other day you loved her and wanted to become her.
Oh yeah, I loved. So the person who founded it was Sister Aimee Semple McPherson. She was from Ontario, Canada, and she was Salvation Army. And like for a lot of people, you know, they see Salvation Army stores and they're like, they don't realize that's a denomination. She was this member of the Salvation Army, and she starts preaching, and she does like tent revivals, and she has a particular sermon that she gives in 1922 where she preaches on Ezekiel 1, which I know like most people are like, why are you choosing Ezekiel 1 to preach on? But she preaches on the vision given to Ezekiel in Ezekiel 1, where you see a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. And she looks at that and she thinks it's a representation of the full gospel. And the full gospel is a Foursquare gospel. And so it becomes, these symbols become, and I have it's my dog, I'm sorry. I have her sermons right here. Lost and Restored. It's the centennial edition of Aimee. It's like so hard to see, but
Oh no, it's good. We can make it out. That's really cool.
but she ends up, I guess this one doesn't have the picture, but she ends up preaching that there's a Foursquare gospel in the Foursquare way, and the four squares are Jesus Christ. That she comes to imagine that this symbol in Ezekiel is representative of Jesus as the Savior, the Baptizer, the Healer, and the soon coming King.
Okay.
And the symbol now doesn't have the ox and everything it used to, and it used to be a wild symbol. Now the symbol is this. So Jesus Christ as Savior, Baptizer, Healer, and King. Oh, Savior, Baptizer, Healer, King.
Okay.
That's my old hymnal. And so that symbol is on all the Foursquare churches. It's everything. And she ends up founding a church the next year, 1923. She goes to Los Angeles and she founds the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel. And she founds it in Echo Park, and you can still go. And I mean, we used to go, and it's called Angela's Temple, and it's huge. It's one of the original mega churches in the United States. It held 5,300 people. It still does. But when Aimee was there, it would hold up to 10,000. Thousands of people came to see her, and she was larger than life. Like she would come in wearing like these like white gowns holding big roses, and she would do these like productions, and you can listen to sermons of her. She was a fiery preacher. She would go into hospitals to heal people. It's like she was a faith healer. For anyone who like is familiar with a lot of faith healers after, a lot of faith healers today claim her anointing or her mantle. Like Benny Hinn is said to like go and lay on her grave in Forest Lawn to like soak up her anointing. Catherine Coleman believes she follows in the path of Aimee.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, she really lays a foundation for this. And she was the first woman on the radio. She founds a radio station. It was a whole thing. Like she's founded Life Pacific College to like train ministers. And the Foursquare, I mean, it takes off. Like if you're Pentecostal in California, like, or you're joining a Pentecostal religion in California, like it's Assembly of God, Foursquare, or Vineyard, and they're all kind of like wrapped up in their history in a lot of ways.
Yeah, excellent. And it's so fascinating because think about this: women that just got the right to vote right as this is happening. She is truly a pioneer. And just so I've talked about this before. So in 1906, you had the Azusa Street Revival, which gave us the modern day Pentecostal movement thereabouts around 1906. There's a kind of a period of time. And so when she gets there, you have Pentecostalism is kind of established, especially because Azusa Street's in the Los Angeles area. So you have this really dynamic thing already going on. And then she comes in and just shakes things up.
Oh yeah. I mean, and I mean, one of the things that made Pentecostalism compelling to people is in a time of immense segregation, Pentecostalism was one of the first religious settings to integrate. They let women preach. And that caused a lot of scandal to people outside of the Pentecostal movement, but it was compelling to a lot of people. And so, I mean, when she built Angela's temple, people joined. And I mean, people heard it on the radio. People were into her. And I
Yeah.
mean, I was into her. I thought she was rad. I mean, she ends up having a very complicated life, where, she's married like multiple times. She stages her own kidnapping to collect the ransom. She does these like pretty wild like fundraising campaigns to build Angela's temple to get it out of debt, which it does. And then she dies of a drug overdose, unfortunately, at a fairly young age. And so, she has this incredibly complicated life. And I mean, aside from the more sordid aspects, like I wanted to be her. Like I dragged people to Venice Beach every weekend to like tell people the gospel. Like
Oh, wow.
I mean, I went to the Dream Center and we knocked on doors in the projects to like convince people to join the Foursquare Church.
Wow.
Which, and like none of this was like, I mean, I have a lot of, I look back on it with a lot of mixed feelings of, I shouldn't have done that. I mean, I'm not like a missionary now. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So,
I definitely, I was going to spread the Foursquare gospel.
I'm really curious. So what was it that made you fall in love with Aimee? Well, was there something, a sermon you read, something she did that said, man, I want to be like her?
She has a sermon called The Scarlet Thread, which I really love. I mean, I loved the whole thing of like the Foursquare gospel. I mean, and she also, I have this book, if for anyone's interested in reading about the history of the church from her perspective, it's called This Is That by Sister Aimee. I mean, this is her, like she's, I mean, she's like this 1920s glamour icon. She was so compelling in so many ways, but she had the sermon called The Scarlet Thread, where it's pretty supersessionist, but she like traces the blood of Christ through like the whole Bible, and then she's like, and you have to grab hold of the scarlet thread and let it guide you home. And I was like, oh, I want to do that. So
Wow.
I preached that sermon a lot.
Oh, wow. Okay. So oh, wow. So maybe just talk a little bit about maybe your experience in that group, some of the highs and the lows that you experienced. I just want to hear, just generally speaking, attending a service, you're associating and affiliating and making friendships with people. Just talk about maybe the social dynamic of belonging to that group.
Yeah, I mean, I was part of a Foursquare Church that was fairly, I mean, it was definitely charismatic. It was definitely Pentecostal. But if you had walked, it wasn't like Vineyard or anything. And like, we would actually say that, like a lot of the youth would be like, well, we're not Vineyard. And for those who don't know, Vineyard is a charismatic movement that is very charismatic in their worship services, in everything. And so we would actually joke and be like, well, we're not Vineyard people. And that's true. We weren't. But I mean, there's a lot of dancing in church services. There's always, it's like a running joke and stereotype, but it's true that there's always someone with a tambourine. And people speak in tongues and people get healed, and people, it's a very charismatic, lively service. But the thing that really struck me is it's a situation where people really believe it. And I mean, I made most of my friends were Foursquare. I ended up, dating in the Foursquare Church, and the person I dated, we both kind of left together. But I remember so vividly this like woman who I became very good friends with, and she got married, in the Foursquare, like to someone that was in our youth group, and she lost her wedding band, and she was just praying that it would come back, and and then she found her wedding band just like on the floor, and she knew it was the Lord. And this like earnestness of belief that God is part of is absolutely intimately connected to the minute details of your life. It was an earnest belief that was also marked by absolutely extraordinary markers of faith.
Interesting. Give me an example of that, of an extraordinary marker of faith.
I mean, I remember going to camp and I always joke for like people who haven't never been to a Pentecostal camp. I'm always like, oh, have you seen Jesus Camp, the movie? Because like that was my camp experience. But college camp, I went to college camp because it was, camp started, I joined the church, and then, I go to college. And I remember, on the night that everyone is like getting saved, and, people are speaking in tongues, and some people couldn't. And I remember the man in front of me was laying down, and a bunch of the youth leaders were going to cast a demon out of him because that was why he couldn't speak in tongues. And I mean, I don't know if he actually ended up speaking in tongues, but it was a really intense experience. Like I mean, and I guess now when I see people speaking in tongues, it's very average to me because it was so much of my early Christian experience. But it's a lot of speaking in tongues. It's a lot of faith healing. It's a lot of like putting your hand on someone and putting your arm in the air and like casting demons out of them. I remember reading a book called Pigs in a Parlor.
Oh yeah.
Did
Mhm.
you read it? Yeah, reading Pigs in the Parlor on like how to do deliverance. Like it's like an at-home guide to deliverance ministry. And my parents like traveled once and I got scared in the house. I was convinced that there was a demon in it. And I like, get my olive oil and like, I'm going to go exercise the house. I'm going to deliver the house of the spirit that's in it. I mean, like, and it was that was just so every day. And my parents were like, what are you doing? Like, okay. They were always very supportive of me, but they're also like, okay, you don't need to deliver the house. Yeah, that book's wild.
Oh
Pigs in the
yeah.
Parlor is wild. And so, yeah, I mean, I ended up looking into going to Life Pacific. I didn't go to Life Pacific. I thank God that my parents were like, no, you need to go somewhere that's not Life Pacific Bible College. I did go to a Foursquare seminary for a year, called King's College. It's King's University now, I think. I don't know. I took biblical Hebrew. I took foundations of Pentecostal theology, and I took a few classes, and then I ended up leaving. But yeah, I was deeply invested.
Wow, this is wild. Yeah, Pigs in the Parlor, man. So I grew up in a Baptist church that practiced deliverance on the south side of Chicago. And there was their pastor was pretty well known in the deliverance ministry as well. And Pigs in the Parlor was one of the standard works, if you will.
Oh yeah, and like for those who don't, it has like a scary cover. It's
Mhm.
like it has like a pig, like
Like a red cover. Was yours a red cover?
no, mine had like it was pink because it had a giant
Yeah,
pig.
pink. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Mhm.
And yeah, and I mean, deliverance was so part of it, like in terms of like Jesus as the healer, like that also meant spiritual healing. And so, like, I remember there was like, an altar call for people who have insomnia or nightmares, and the spirit of insomnia was cast out of me. Like everything is connected to a spirit, everything negative is connected to a spirit of something that can be cast out of you. So
Wow.
it's a very common, that's very common language. It's just like,
Yeah.
oh, I have a spirit of anxiety, I have a spirit of depression, I have a spirit of whatever. So yeah, deliverance ministry was huge.
I didn't know. You don't see that typically in some of the other Pentecostal branches, that intense exorcism stuff. That's very fascinating. I appreciate you sharing that with me and the audience. I wanted to ask now, so you're seeing these like manifestations, you actually get a healing. What's kind of some of the things that happened that kind of led you out?
I mean, I couldn't speak in tongues. So I wanted to be a I wanted to be a Foursquare minister, but I can't because I don't speak in tongues. And it wasn't so much that I couldn't be a minister, but it was kind of realizing like there's weird barriers to what your salvation means when you're Pentecostal, when you're specifically Foursquare Pentecostal. And that was kind of strange to me. But also my whole salvation is in question. Why am I doing this if I'm not really saved? And so that was really hard. Around the same time I start college, I move. Well, I don't move, but I'm going to a college that's further away. And um, there's more non-denominational churches than there are Foursquare churches. I start going to a non-denominational mega church. I start going to Rock Harbor with my boyfriend at the time, and that kind of just becomes what we're going to do. Also around the same time, I kind of started to recognize a lot of problems with women's leadership in the Foursquare Church, that it was founded by a woman, but they've never had a woman president again.
Mhm.
And that was kind of strange to me. I actually had an academic advisor at Azusa Pacific. I looked into going there, and I said I wanted to be a minister, and he was like, well, you're a woman, so.
It's so fascinating. That's one of the detriments of the Pentecostal movement, is that originally it was definitely much more female oriented. As a matter of fact, within the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, women cannot be bishops. And so they keep them, so that even though they can be pastors, they can't be bishops. My friend, well, I won't get into the politics of that particular church, but but it is interesting that often happens, that even churches that have a matriarchal structure or ideas of having female leadership eventually becomes like the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I don't know the last time they've had a female head since their founder, Ellen White, right? And so definitely, so you're seeing a barrier there. Now, I do have a quick question for you. One of the best known current ministers, or I don't even know if he's still alive, is Jack Hayford. Did you ever have any interactions with Jack Hayford?
Jack Hayford was the president of the Foursquare Church when I was Foursquare.
Oh, so he
and that's
was your
really
president.
the extent. Yeah, he was the president of the church, which I like. I mean, I say that into like a largely Mormon audience when the president of the church is like, Jack Hayford wasn't really that. I mean, he spoke at the conference, which was another kind of weird moment for me when, I really liked, like I mentioned that like my church was Pentecostal, charismatic, but that was it. Going to the Foursquare convention was the first time that I was like, oh no, I'm not Pentecostal, I'm Foursquare. Like it was like the denominational identity of it became really intense. And I remember sitting in the convention, it's in the Anaheim Convention Center. So it's like thousands of people. And everyone lifts up their arms and says, "We are Foursquare." And I was like, I don't think I'm Foursquare. Like it was the first time where I was like, I'm actually not this. Weird. And that was really strange. And it was at the same time where I was starting to go to a non-denominational church. Around that time, I started developing a really intense anxiety around dying. And all of this kind of comes together. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm Foursquare. Non-denominationalism is fine. And then I became like, the slippery slope argument of like really Foursquare, non-denominational, lukewarm Christian, out.
Yep. You definitely, you definitely followed that path, and this is great. So how old were you when you finally transitioned out of the Church of the Foursquare?
I was 22.
Okay.
I think no, I was 21. It was like late being 21.
Okay. And then so you go into the non-denominational world. Was there anything you wanted to talk about with regard to that whole situation?
I had a pretty generic non-denominational experience. I was part of a church that was, it was pretty generically non-denominational. It's like a Southern California church. But we did have, so I was already like kind of anxious about dying, which ends up really being like, what is Christianity if like my fear of death is not assuaged at all? And so that, there was like kind of internal conflicts about that. And at the same time, we get a new pastor who came from a church in Michigan that was run by a very controversial pastor named Rob Bell.
Okay.
And yeah, you didn't think there was going to be an emergent church element just wedged in there.
Okay.
And we had to have like a bit. So I was doing.
Well, just real quick, what was the emergent church? So maybe just talk a little bit about that, what that was all about.
So
and Rob Bell.
So there was like a movement toward kind of adapting, like what is Christianity in the modern world, adapting Christianity for the youth, all of that. And Rob Bell becomes like a really foundational figure in this movement of making Christianity relatable and cool. And a lot of people thought that meant watering down Christianity. And Rob Bell follows this like slippery slope path where now he only preaches in a comedy club in LA. And he writes a lot of really popular books. And so I'm like part of this situation. I was doing a lot of youth ministry. I was also part of the Alpha team, which is like, Alpha is like a ministry for like people who are new. It comes out of Holy Trinity, Brompton in England. Bear Grylls, the survivalist, did it. And so I was part of, all of these ministries. And then we have to have this big meeting for everyone who's involved on, are we an emergent church? And I was like, what is an emergent church? And so of course I read Rob Bell's book, Love Wins, which is like, maybe there's not a hell. And all of a sudden, like my fear about dying is I'm like, well, if there's not a hell or a heaven, maybe there's nothing. And then my biggest fear is true. And so Rob Bell kind of leads me out of Christianity, which is so funny because it's like, that's what everyone said. Like everyone was saying Rob Bell is driving the youth out of the church, and he did.
Yeah,
He drove me
interesting.
out.
Okay, reading this stuff.
I have a lot of affection for Rob Bell now. I actually just listened to his audiobook on Leviticus, like a commentary on Leviticus, and it was rad. Like, I highly recommend, if you've ever thought Leviticus was boring, to read Rob Bell talk about it for 10 hours. But yeah, it was like an interesting thing where like the Christian world's biggest fears, like in that moment, were all very true, like in my life.
Wow. This is okay. So now I think we want to talk about now another born again experience you would have. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I start grad school kind of not anything. I signed up to go to grad school because I'm interested in religion, obviously. Like, what else am I going to study? And so I finished undergrad, and I have a lot of like wild experiences meeting various Christian people. I sat, in my last history of Christianity class in undergrad, I sat in between a nun and an Orthodox Presbyterian who had opinions about each other. Um, and I remember looking at him because he loved John Calvin, and he like bled tulip, and he was getting ready to go to the Orthodox Presbyterian Seminary in California. And I asked him like what he like makes of India, like the nation of India, given that India's not Christian. And he just looked at me with like all the seriousness in the world, and he was like, "Oh, that's a vessel of God's wrath." And I was like, "What is I was Christian. This isn't what?" And so, I decided I'm going to go to grad school. I'm going to study religion. And I'm interested in the 19th century because all these religions that I was interested in come out of the 19th century. Like, what is happening in the 19th century? And we'll kind of get to a story about how I end up studying Mormons. But in the middle of this, I'm going to be doing my doctoral exams. And my major field is American religion. My minor field is history of Christianity. So I had to read the history of Christianity. And in the midst of reading them, the man that I, was Foursquare with for a while, we actually we're going on a trip. We get engaged. We don't end up getting married, but we're going on a trip to Europe as I'm in the middle of reading for my exams. And I read a book right before we leave on this trip called Christ's Church is Purely Reformed, A Social History of Calvinism. And I was so mad at the Reformation because I realized, it was like the first book really on the Reformation I'd ever read. And I realized a lot of my ideas about the Reformation was a caricature. Being Pentecostal, I thought Roman Catholics were the cult of Mary. I thought I had a lot of opinions based on a vision of the Reformation that wasn't historically accurate. And so I was reading this book, and there's like scenes of like the hosts being fed to dogs and reformers killing people and reformers like crushing statues. And I was like viscerally mad, and I didn't really know why, because I'm not invested in this. And in a perfect storm, we go on a trip and we land in Rome on our cruise. And I had just read this book, and we get in line, 6-hour wait to go in St. Peter's Basilica. I walk inside and I'm like, well, I'm a Roman Catholic now. That's it.
Just like that, you had this Damascus Road experience. You walk into St. Peter's Cathedral, and bam, you say, "I'm a Catholic. I'm a believer."
Which is so funny because it's a born again Pentecostal experience, but it's for a religion that does not usually have markers of that. Usually people don't convert to Catholicism, and if they do, it's kind of a slower process of reading history, or which I had been doing, but I very much had a moment where I see the Pietà, I see the altar. There's a little sign next to the altar that says, "Here lies Peter, the first pope." And I was like, well, there he is. And my fiance at the time, he was just like, "No, you don't believe this. Like, come on." And I was just like, I've never believed anything more than in this moment than Peter is right there. And I get on the Vatican Wi-Fi. I Google the San Juan Capistrano, California Basilica, where my grandmother went, and I find the religious education email, and I'm like, how do I become a Catholic? And I start RCIA right when I get home from the trip.
Wow, that's just amazing. So I'm curious, so you're a practicing Catholic. One of the things I thought was really cool last year at the Mormon History Association, they had you do one of the prayers for one of the luncheons, and you went full Catholic. You did your Mary and your sign of the cross and all that good stuff.
I did. I did. Yeah. So that Mormon History Association at the lunch, they ask a lot of people to do the prayer. I know that John Turner, who wrote Brigham Young Pioneer Prophet, he's done the prayer. He's not Mormon. So that is absolutely part of the tradition of just letting the diverse Mormon studies community do the prayer. I actually had someone after that was like, you did the whole Catholic thing. And I was like, yeah, I'm Catholic. We cross ourselves before we pray. And I actually had a really interesting experience after because you say like in the name of Jesus, but then as a Catholic, I always add through the intercession of Our Lady of Sorrows, who's the version of Mary that I'm most closely, I did a consecration for her, it's a whole thing. But a woman came up to me after really emotional about it. And she was like, who is Our Lady of Sorrows? Mormon feminists have been looking for Heavenly Mother forever. Like, what is happening? And so I had like a pretty extended conversation with a woman who is part of the Mormon feminist community. She's also a great scholar, of course, about Mary. And so I think what's interesting about Mormon History Association allowing diverse religious people to do the prayer is it ends up leading to these really interesting conversations about this community that everyone assumes is Mormon until you have a woman invoking Our Lady of Sorrows at the lunch prayer. And then it's like, what is this? So I did a very Catholic prayer.
So you can tell, Christina, I'm a bit of a fanboy, because I'm telling you all these things, but I find it so interesting that you did that, and that really struck me. I was like, okay, this is really, really cool, and I'm so glad you did that. And I think it's really awesome. The Mormon History Association affords different voices to be heard in the context of prayer, which I think is really cool. Props to them.
Yeah. Mormon studies generally has a long history of devotional scholarship and what they call disciple scholars, of creating, like BYU, like the Maxwell Institute is really invested in creating disciple scholars, which has a long tradition with Leonard Arrington, etc. But I have appreciated that they're also like willing to talk about what that looks like for people who aren't Mormon.
That's great. So we were talking off camera about a particular book you might recommend about Catholicism that you might want to share with the audience.
Yeah, I have two actually. I lied.
Okay. Let's see.
So it's not really about Catholicism, but if anyone's interested in the history of Christianity, there's a really great book called The Documents of the Christian Church. It's by Oxford. It's literally just the primary documents, starting with Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote the first history of Christianity in the year like 30, no. It was like the year like 43 or something. 63 is the year. And then it goes all the way to like the British churches in the 17th century, Vatican II, and it's all the primary documents of the church. And then one that I just really love, that kind of really exemplifies the things that I find compelling about Catholicism. Carolyn Walker Bynum is a scholar who does incredible work on early and medieval Catholic history. She wrote a book called Holy Feast, Holy Fast, Religious Significance of Food to Medieval Women. And it's a really fascinating history of how food has operated in the lives of medieval women. And one of the things that I find so interesting about it is every time I read about medieval Catholicism, Catholics have this vision of their church as being the most authentic one. We have never changed. And I love reading medieval Catholicism because I look at it and I'm like, well, I'm not this religion. Like whatever this is not me. And so it's such a fascinating look, especially at what religious women of that time were doing. And it's a rad book. So recommend that.
Awesome. So was there anything else you wanted to share about your Catholic experience?
No, I'm still Catholic.
Okay, great. This is awesome. Yeah, I've got some friends who MDiv, went to Steubenville, Franciscan University. I've met Scott Hahn, stuff like that. So I'm familiar. I got a lot of good shout out to all my Catholic friends.
Rome Sweet Home.
That's right.
Have you read Rome Sweet Home?
I think I've read part of it. This was when I was getting into my debates, when I was still a Calvinist, and I'd get into debates with the Catholics and I'd read their stuff and Scott Hahn and everything like that. Like I tell people, I used to be a Calvinist and then I found Jesus. But it's interesting stuff. I'm fascinated by Catholicism too. As a matter of fact, there was a time where I got this close.
You
So,
take converts.
yeah, I know you do. So that's the whole point of this. Apparently, maybe it's not the Mormons that are going to convert me. It's probably going to be you.
I mean, for those who don't know, Scott Hahn is kind of like the Catholic
Yes.
apologist.
Yes.
He has written so many books on different aspects of Catholic faith, like the Wedding Supper of the Lamb, no, the Lamb Supper, which is about the Eucharist, Hail Holy Queen, which is about Catholic devotion to Mary. Like he kind of, and he does it like through the Bible and through like a very Protestant lens because he's a convert from Protestantism. So if anyone's interested in what Catholic apologetics looks like, it's interesting because he does it very Protestant.
Yeah. I sat in one of his classes, and it was very Protestant in its orientation. He does modern biblical scholarship within the Catholic context, which is a really fascinating thing.
Yeah, he's interesting.
Yeah, he is. So what I want to now transition to is this. Okay, so we got this Catholic convert, and you're doing religious studies. You were one of your areas of study was 19th century communitarianism. I think we should probably talk about that because that kind of leads us how you end up studying Mormonism and most specifically Mormon fundamentalism.
Yeah, I have a book recommendation.
Oh, sure, please.
I was interested in communitarianism. So the 19th century was a time of like people living communally for religion. So like when Mormons think of the United Order, they weren't alone in this vision. So there's a great book called America's Communal Utopias. It's an edited volume that it covers Mormonism, it covers Korean unity, it covers Oneida, it covers the Shakers, it covers all of the major communitarian religions. And I originally, I was interested in all of them. Oneida was super interesting to me, but the other one that I was just so into was the Shakers. So if anyone's interested, Shaker experience in America, highly recommend. But then, I'm in this class where I'm doing American Communal Utopias, and what do I get assigned but Rough Stone Rolling?
Okay.
And I sit down to read, in grad programs, you're having to read usually a book per class per week. And, I'm like visiting my parents, and I sit down at the kitchen table and I crack open Rough Stone Rolling, and I do not stop. I read it in 2 days. It just consumed. Oh, I got, is yours shiny?
Mm-hmm.
I have the matte cover.
Yeah. Maybe, yeah, I've read this baby at least 3 or 4 times, man.
Yeah, it's it changed my life. So yeah, I couldn't put it down. I didn't, like, my parents were just like kept walking by the kitchen table to me, just like not putting down this book for 2 days straight. And I was just like, this is what I need to study. Like this is it. Like this is the history. I end up getting Mike Quinn's Magic Worldview next. That's the next book I read. And then in the midst of that, I read Sidney Alstrom's Religious History of the American People. Highly recommend. It's huge, but it's like the book. Yep. And I also, Catherine Albany's Republic of Mind and Spirit. It's another massive book, but highly recommend Mormons make a like splash in that one. And that was it. I was like, this is incredible. I end up going to the woman who becomes my advisor, Dr. Amanda Lucia, and I was like, I think I want to study the Mormons. And she was like, okay, why? Like, okay. And she tells me to go to, she's like, you're an ethnographer, you study living people, you need to, like, why don't you like go to church or something, like go hang out with them. And I did, and there was, I've said this a few times, and it's not in any way to be inflammatory or offensive, but I went into an LDS institute and then to a YSA ward, and there was like a level of like kind of disappointment where it wasn't Rough Stone Rolling, right?
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't communitarianism. No, they still have this idea of consecration, but no one's, doing like, no one's building the United Order. The United Order of Enoch is gone. And that was kind of like a bummer. Like no one's talking about Kolob just on the regular. Polygamy is, of course, not there in a visible way. And so I was just like, what's a Mormon? What is a Mormon? And so that was kind of my early wondering of what is Mormonism if it's not rough stone ruling.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so this is what probably kind of prompts you to maybe look at other expressions of Mormonism, because maybe some of them are more closely aligned with what we could look at as 19th century Mormonism.
Yeah, I mean, I end up meeting, I didn't know Mormon fundamentalism was a thing. I didn't know Mormonism was a thing really until I read Rough Stone Rolling. I knew that I had, in high school, there were two people who were Mormon. One of them went to seminary in the morning, but like I didn't, he was also like captain, like on the surf team. Like I don't know what a Mormon is. Um, and so I definitely didn't know what a Mormon fundamentalist was. Like that was not part of my purview. But as I started doing, I go to Utah. I moved to Utah to start doing archival work. And through Sunstone and other things, I ended up meeting Mormon fundamentalists.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, I found the Mormons.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on what we mean by modern Mormonism and authentic Mormonism. And a lot of people say if Joseph Smith were to come back, he would think the FLDS are his. I don't think that's true. I mean, I don't think there's any Mormonism that looks like what Joseph Smith was doing. All Mormonisms are modern, and that they're around right now. And
Good point.
so, but I meet Mormon fundamentalists, and I just become so interested, and not interested in the polygamy. I mean, a lot of people are really interested in polygamy, and I mean, I've written about polygamy. But I just become really interested in how their doctrine works. And because I think Mormon fundamentalism is very often collapsed into being synonymous with polygamy, but there's so much more about Mormon fundamentalism. I mean, I wrote an article recently on Joseph Smith being the Holy Ghost. Like, that's a rad idea. That is a doctrine that deserves to be talked about a little more, and has nothing to do with polygamy. So they have their own unique set of ideas and beliefs about the world. And I just became, that was it. I was going to study Mormon fundamentalism. At the time, I mean, still there's a lot of great resources on that. Craig Foster and Marianne Watson's American Polygamy is great. One of the earliest books I read was Martha Bradley's Kidnapped from That Land.
Oh,
on
yeah.
the Short Creek Raid.
Mhm.
The 1953 Short Creek Raid really transformed Short Creek. I argue it like created what the FLDS became. Highly recommend. And then kind of like the book is Brian Hales' Modern Polygamy and Mormon Fundamentalism, the generations after the manifesto. And I hear Brian Hales get kind of a bad rap as being like an apologist. But I am here to say that, I don't necessarily agree, of course, with Brian's conclusions, because if I did, I would be a member of the church. But there was no one that did the heavy lifting of going through the documents, of writing the early histories better than Brian Hales. Like he carried the study of Mormon fundamentalism for years. And so he deserves a lot of credit for the archival work and the document digging that he did.
So you're saying this is very unique, because a lot of people get interested in fundamentalism because of polygamy, but it wasn't that. It was their doctrines. And one of your favorite doctrines, if you will, is the Adam God one. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I find interesting, I mean, yes, people really like polygamy, but I mean, I went into studying Mormonism having read about the Shakers, who are celibate, and reading about Oneida, who did complex marriage,
Mhm.
and so which has a polygamy element. And so the polygamy thing wasn't interesting. I mean, it was, but it wasn't like the thing to me, because then everyone was doing sex weird in the 19th century. Like
Yep.
it was a hallmark. So I went into Mormonism without that being this like shocking thing. I mean, the way Mormons do it is of course interesting, but it wasn't the thing. But I noticed that, it's always so funny when you meet evangelicals who have like the anti-Mormon literature, and then you quickly realize that anti-Mormon literature is just fundamentalist doctrine. Like I went to the Manti pageant with a group of fundamentalist missionaries, and one of the preachers was like, "Did you know that they thought that Adam was God?" And this sweet kid was like, "Yeah, I still think that."
That's right.
Like, and so how do evangelicals combat Mormon
Yeah.
fundamentalism? They would be the hardest Mormons to proselyte to, because they believe in polygamy, they believe Adam is God, they believe in blood atonement. Like, what are you going to do? You're not going to stump these kids.
And actually, I think I had that kid on one of my programs too, and he talked about that whole thing. That's great. You go, Fundies, because I love that you are doing that, because I think it really does throw a curveball to evangelicals. They have their script they're supposed to work off of it, and then it's like, no, that's not the answer I was expecting.
I know, I mean, and I think fundamentalists have a particular version of history that they tell, but they talk about a lot of those things more openly because they read the Journal of Discourses. And so, from my background, there was a time when I didn't like Mormons. I know, I'm sorry, but like, what Foursquare kid thinks Mormons are going to heaven, right? I mean, come on. I need a little grace for that. But so I knew all those talking points. Like, I knew that Mormons thought Adam was God when I was Foursquare. And then, but I had a caricature of that in my mind, and I had never read the Journal of Discourses. I had never read the lecture at the Veil. Like, I didn't, I had no idea. And then when I was digging into fundamentalist doctrine, and mainly like now, I just submitted my book on Joseph Musser, who really developed the doctrine of Adam being God. I realized that it's a very complex system that I would say is kind of foundational for Mormonism, that really lays out, Mormons talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ as kind of an example of how they will be resurrected. But in Adam, there's an example of exaltation, which is super rad to think about. There's an actual example of someone who did exaltation. You can point to him, and his name's Adam. And he had in Mormonism, when people talk about as God once was, a logical question to me was, okay, well then who was Adam's God, right? Or who was God's God, not Adam's, in LDS Mormonism. And a lot of LDS people, of course will say, like, we don't know, different answers. But then when I met fundamentalists and I was like, okay, well, who's Adam's God? And they were like, Jehovah, obviously. And I was like, well, who's Jehovah's dad? And they're like, Elohim, obviously. Like, and they were just like, duh. Like, and it's the Adam God doctrine is interesting because it creates an unbroken chain of priesthood through all eternity. So it makes it it's a really compelling doctrine, I think, that makes exaltation make a lot of sense. It makes a lot of the a lot of threads of Mormonism make sense that are no longer part of the LDS Church. So I just fell in love with it.
So what has been one of your biggest takeaways engaging Mormonism and Mormon fundamentalism? But maybe just something that you want to impart to the audience, or something that would maybe changed your mind on something, or just kind of struck you, whatever you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think with Mormon fundamentalism, probably I get the most questions about it, like, because people have a very particular vision of what a Mormon fundamentalist is based on media and everything. And I get a lot of questions of like, aren't they just weird? And I think especially with, well, I remember one of the first times I was talking to my mom and about Mormonism, and she was like, don't they think that God has a body? And like, because that was a really foreign idea to most people. And she didn't say it, but I could see in her eyes that she was like, really like, what? How does that? And I was like, yeah, but I think Jesus becomes a wafer every day.
Right.
And so like Mormonism might be weird, but like, it's absolutely no weirder than anyone else. Like, we're all just people. And so that was I think, becoming Catholic at the same time that I'm studying Mormonism really put a lot of people's criticisms of Mormonism into perspective. There's definitely things in Mormonism I don't agree with. If I did, I would be a Mormon. But that's kind of the biggest thing is, studying religion academically is a really kind of powerful way of humanizing people. And so that's kind of why I encourage people to study religion, because it really humanizes the human experience.
And not only study it, but then engage the folk, and you learn so much. I'll just my interview with Ann Wild's really good. If you want to kind of get to know her, that will probably be her last interview she'll ever give. And also I had like 7 different members from the Christ branch come, and I think one of those kids was the one that was one of those missionaries. And he gives this really wild story about battling demons and becoming born again. Pretty interesting stuff. So, but when I was done, this was a Saturday night. Okay, it's a Saturday night, and it's like we finished up like at 11 o'clock Eastern time, and Benjamin Schaefer set it up, because it was during their general conference. And I thought, this was one of the greatest Saturday nights I've ever had. Now I have to tell you, I used to go out and party a lot and drink. So I say, it's definitely in the top 5 all-time greatest Saturdays I ever had, but I at least remember this one. And it was fun because one of the things that I realized was there's such nice people. And I thought I could be neighbors with all those 7 of those people, including, we had like a 17-year-old girl all the way to the founding prophet's last surviving widow came on the program, and everybody in between. And it was so cool. And it was so humanizing. I really liked everybody.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I usually say when people are like, well, they're a cult. And I'm like, well, why don't you like talk to them? Like,
Yeah.
what are you doing? Like, this isn't hard. Yeah, I think studying people I think it's an important thing. Mormon fundamentalism generally has had a lot of history done of it. It hasn't had a lot of ethnography. Janet Benyon is kind of noteworthy as being someone who went and talked to people and studied people. But I think it really adds contours to the study of Mormonism that have really been missing.
So I'm going to ask you to preview Sunstone, what's coming up, but I'd like for maybe you to, if you don't mind moving your camera, and maybe talk about some of these interesting things that are hanging on your wall behind you.
Sure. So I have Truth magazine, one of the first issues.
And Truth was the fundamentalist newspaper, right? Publication.
Yeah, so this is it's the original of Truth magazine, of the 3rd volume. Brian Buchanan at Benchmark Books sent this to me when I submitted my manuscript for the biography I'm doing of Joseph Musser. Joseph Musser was the editor of Truth magazine. And so I'm probably the only Gentile that has read every single issue of Truth and of its sequel, Star of Truth, that his son did. And so Brian sent me that to kind of congratulate me. This is a plaque that if you go down to Short Creek, and there's some in Salt Lake, Zion hangs over the doors. This one belonged to Rulon Jeffs.
Wow.
His grandson took it off the house before he passed. And I remember he took him down, and I was like, what are you going to do with that? Like, I don't think what are you going to do? Like, and so he gave me one of them. He gave someone another one. I have the First Vision. It's a modern representation of the First Vision. And on it are puffy stickers that say "Keep Sweet," and it's a puffy sticker of Warren Jeffs.
Okay.
If you go down to Short Creek, this was years ago, but when the houses first foreclosed, there was a lot of stuff left in them. And one of the main things left in the hair rooms were stickers on the mirrors that were either of Warren or of the phrase "Keep Sweet." So I have a few of those. I have Salt Lake. I have the Articles of Faith that I bought from the dairy store in Short Creek. But LDS people might find it interesting that this is the Articles of Faith of the FLDS.
Oh, wow.
They're the Articles of Faith. They're the ones you know. And of course, Joseph.
Cool.
And then I've Rulon, another sign from Rulon, and I have a pair of headphones. A lot of people don't know that the early fundamentalist movement was bankrolled by the inventor of headphones, Nathaniel Baldwin. Your face,
wow.
You're like, and so I have one of the original headphones that were produced, and one of the pamphlets that he published, one of the only ones that he published himself. And so, yeah, the headphones, Nathaniel Baldwin, his factory employed most of the early fundamentalists.
Okay.
And a lot of the money went to producing their publication. So that's my weird Mormon wall.
I love it. It's so awesome you sharing that with us today. I think it's so cool. I wanted to ask you, before we talk about previewing Sunstone, were there any other books that you wanted to talk about to the audience?
I was going to say Pioneer Prophet. I really recommend, if you're interested in American religious history, John Butler, Awash in a Sea of Faith. I think that's a really incredible book. And then The Democratization of American Christianity by Nathan Hatch. It talks about Mormonism, but it talks about really kind of it's about the Second Great Awakening, and it touches on what happened in the Second Great Awakening that allowed for so many religions to flourish, one being, of course, Mormonism.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. So Sunstone's coming up, folks. I'm planning on releasing this episode before Sunstone, if all goes according to plan. So why don't you kind of preview for the audience what you're going to be doing at Sunstone? I guess you're doing something with Moroni Lopez Jessop. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I love Sunstone. It's one of my favorite things that I do every year. So I hope everyone comes. Moroni and I are doing a panel on the priesthood and temple restrictions in fundamentalism. I've written about the temple. So Mormon fundamentalists, most of them, with the exception of two groups, uphold the priesthood and temple ban. That still is part of Mormon fundamentalism. I've written about how my argument is that didn't become a fundamental of fundamentalism until the LDS Church decided to lift it. We don't see a lot of reference to the ban in fundamentalism until the 70s. So I'm going to be talking about that history, and then Moroni is going to be sharing his own experience with the priesthood ban, as well as talking about a new movement that is lifting the ban.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting stuff. I think I can see fundamentalism heading in that direction. I think it's.
I think it can go both ways. I mean, I definitely think there's a reactionary element to. I mean, fundamentalism as a tradition, it was reacting to something, but we do know that Ross LeBaron Sr. did ritually adopt through the law of adoption a Black man. So there's question on whether the LeBaron line has a potential to lift the ban. And then Moroni has talked about how in an independent group in Missouri, they have had an interracial marriage ceiling. So we'll see. I mean, that's what we're at. That's our Sunstone presentation. We're asking, like, is there a path in fundamentalism that is inclusive of all people? We'll see.
Stay tuned, folks. We're going to hear the latest. What's going to be the next big doctrinal reformation, perhaps within a movement, and who knows what's going to happen. It's very fascinating stuff. And it's really cool because, like, I get to talk to these people and hear, like, I was just talking to somebody on the phone the other day about the Missouri things. Like, oh, that's right, I remember reading about that. So it's fascinating stuff to see all of that. Mormonism is just like the most interesting, like you study all these other religions, and I was on Mormon Stories, and I talked about how I was really personally interested in all these other religions myself. But I said Mormonism just kept pulling me back. I couldn't get enough of it.
I know. I mean, I keep saying, like, I have someone, like, I keep wondering, like, maybe I'll just study the Shakers, or, my boyfriend was raised Mennonite, and going up to Canada to see him and seeing where he grew up, I was like, oh, like, I could just study the Mennonites. And then I'm like suddenly like waist deep in like 4 new Mormon projects. So
yeah, that's pretty well. Now, did you, Rebecca Jensen, she's a Mennonite who wrote that book, Liminal Sovereignty. I think you met her last year, right? That was a really cool book, and I had her on.
Yeah, and she just spoke at the National Endowment for Humanities group institute that we're doing on Mormonism and Mexico. So yeah, I mean, her work on that, the comparative work on how Mennonites and Mormons were treated in Mexico, is super interesting, for sure.
It really is. Yeah. So folks, check out my catalog, because I've talked to a lot of these people. Cristina, I really appreciate you coming on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's so weird to talk about not Mormonism and talking about the Foursquare Church.
This is where the convergence happens. The convergence happens here on this channel. And I think it's good because you're educating. I like to bring on ministers from different churches, theologians, to explain their history. And so I think now the audience has a better understanding of the Foursquare movement, and also non-denominationalism, and your Catholic faith and how much it means to you. And I think these are good things. I think it's really cool.
Awesome.
And you have any final words to share with the audience, or you good?
I just hope to see you all at Sunstone.
Sunstone. I'm going to be the umpire for the kickball game between the Exmos and the fundamentalists. So I'm very excited about that.
I did that. I was the umpire at the inaugural one. So I think you're my successor.
Oh, this is great. Awesome sauce. Love it. So folks, I want to thank you so much for watching the program today. I just want to remind you to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the like button on this video. We're available on all the major podcasts. Anthony's slaving away to get the rest of our podcast stuff. So you can check us out on Spotify and Apple. MormonBookReviews.com. That's the merch store. So if you're interested in purchasing some of our lovely merch, please go to MormonBookReviews.com. And for those of you who would like to support the channel on both PayPal and or Patreon, I will leave links in the description. I really do appreciate it, because really the channel funds my trips, like to Sunstone, but it costs a lot of money, and I'm trying to get more built up so I can buy cameras, upgrade my equipment, but a lot of my money goes towards travel budget. So those of you who have a little extra money that you want to throw to this little channel, it's greatly appreciated. So folks, you have yourself a great day. Enjoy this really, really hot summer that we're all experiencing, and be well.